The silent ward. The hospital had a wing that no one talked about, a section so isolated that it had been sealed off for decades. When renovations began, the construction crew unearthed the old, forgotten ward. It was as if the hospital had tried to bury its past. As the crew began work, strange things started happening. Tools went missing, lights flickered, and the temperature dropped whenever they approached the sealed doors. One night, a janitor named Mark was assigned to clean the area. He had heard the stories but didn't believe in ghosts. As he mopped the floors, he noticed something odd. A single set of muddy footprints leading to the sealed doors. He knew he was the only one there, yet the footprints were fresh. Mark's curiosity got the better of him, and he pried open the doors. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The ward was a relic from the past. Beds rusted, sheets yellowed, and a faint smell of antiseptic lingered. But what unnerved him most was the silence. A silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. As he ventured deeper into the ward, he found an old, rusted bed with leather straps and a journal tucked under the mattress. The entries were erratic, written by a doctor who had been tasked with curing the patients in this wing. The journal detailed the experiments, inhumane procedures that left the patients in agony. The last entry simply read, "They won't let me leave." Mark felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. Panic set in as the silence grew louder, pressing against his ears like a scream. The door slammed shut behind him, and he realized he wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, shifting into human forms. Patients long dead, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Mark ran for the door, but the shadows were faster. They engulfed him, pulling him into their silent world. The next morning, the workers found the ward sealed shut again, and Mark was never seen or heard from again. The only trace of him was his mop, lying in front of the sealed doors, the floor around it covered in muddy footprints. The wrong surgery. Nurse Elaine had worked at St. Mary's Hospital for over a decade. She knew every patient, every doctor, and every dark corner of the hospital's history. But nothing had prepared her for the day she was assigned to the night shift in the surgical wing. That night, a patient was scheduled for a routine appendectomy, but things quickly went wrong. The surgeon, Dr. Harris, was renowned for his skill, but that night he seemed off, distracted, agitated. Elaine noticed him glancing nervously at the clock, his hands trembling slightly as he scrubbed in. The patient, a young woman named Lily, was already under anesthesia when they entered the operating room. The room felt colder than usual, the lights dimmer. As the surgery began, Dr. Harris made the first incision, but instead of blood, a thick, black fluid oozed from the wound. Elaine gasped, but Dr. Harris continued, his face expressionless. The monitors began to beep wildly, but when Elaine looked, the readings were normal. It was as if the equipment was malfunctioning, but she knew it wasn't. Then, without warning, Lily's eyes snapped open, even though she was still under anesthesia. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Elaine tried to speak, but her voice was gone. The room began to warp, the walls closing in, and the shadows growing longer. The black fluid from the incision spread across the floor, consuming everything in its path. Dr. Harris, now covered in the black substance, turned to Elaine, his eyes empty. "We shouldn't be here," he whispered, the only sound she could hear. Elaine tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The black fluid reached her feet, climbing up her body, freezing her in place. Just as it covered her mouth, she woke up in the break room, drenched in sweat. It was morning and the night shift was over. She rushed to check on Lily, but her bed was empty, the room spotless as if she had never been there. When Elaine asked about Lily, the staff looked at her with confusion. There had been no surgery scheduled that night. Elaine never worked the night shift again, but she couldn't shake the memory of Lily's eyes, wide with terror, or the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong in that operating room. And every night since, she dreams of the black fluid spreading across the floor, and she wonders if one day it will find her again. The longest night. Daniel, a medical intern, had just started his first night shift at the hospital. He was eager to learn but apprehensive about the tales he'd heard from other interns about the fourth floor. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened there at night, but Daniel dismissed it as nothing more than superstitious nonsense. His shift was uneventful until around 3 a.m. when he was called to the fourth floor for a patient check. The halls were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a thunderclap. As he reached the patient's room, he saw her, a frail, elderly woman sitting up in bed, staring blankly at the wall. "Good evening, ma'am," Daniel said, trying to sound cheerful. But she didn't respond. Her eyes were glazed over, her mouth slightly open. He checked her vitals. Everything was normal, but she remained unresponsive. He decided to step out and get a second opinion, but when he returned with a senior nurse, the bed was empty. The sheets were neatly folded, and the room looked untouched. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, confused. The nurse frowned. "This room hasn't been occupied for weeks. Are you sure you were in here?" Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He was certain he had seen the woman, but the nurse insisted there was no record of any patient in that room. Disturbed, Daniel returned to his rounds, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As the night wore on, Daniel kept seeing glimpses of the elderly woman in his peripheral vision, just a flash of white hair or the edge of a hospital gown. But whenever he turned, there was nothing there. The longer he stayed on the fourth floor, the more intense the feeling became, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. Finally, at dawn, as he was about to leave, he saw her again, this time at the end of the hallway, her back turned to him. Gathering his courage, he approached her, but as he got closer, she slowly turned around. Her face was not that of a frail old woman, but a decaying corpse, eyes sunken, mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Daniel screamed, stumbling backward, and when he looked again, she was gone. The hallway was empty, the light of dawn streaming through the windows. He ran down the stairs, vowing never to set foot on the fourth floor again. But the image of the woman haunted him, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, waiting for him at the end of the hallway. The infected. Dr. Emily Carter was a specialist in infectious diseases, dedicated to her work at the city hospital. When a new patient was admitted with an unknown illness, Emily was assigned to the case. The patient, a man in his early 30s, was covered in strange, festering wounds that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. His vitals were erratic, and no one could determine what was wrong with him. As Emily examined him, the man suddenly grabbed her wrist, his grip impossibly strong. "They're coming for you," he rasped, his eyes wide with fear. Before Emily could respond, he released her and fell into a coma. The words echoed in her mind, but she dismissed them as the ravings of a delirious man. Over the next few days, the hospital was gripped by panic. More patients arrived with similar symptoms, each one more severe than the last. The disease spread rapidly, and despite her best efforts, Emily couldn't stop it. But the worst part wasn't the disease itself. It was the way the patients reacted just before they died. They all said the same thing, "They're coming for you." As the hospital became overwhelmed, Emily started noticing changes in her own body. Small, subtle things at first. A persistent itch on her arm, a slight fever, strange dreams where she was running through dark, narrow corridors. But soon, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Her skin began to break out in sores, just like the patients she had treated. Desperate, Emily locked herself in the lab, searching for a cure. She worked for days without sleep, her condition worsening, but she refused to give up. But the more she studied the disease, the more she realized that it wasn't natural. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent, and it was spreading not just through contact, but through fear. The final stage of the disease was madness, a complete loss of self as the infection took over the mind. Emily's thoughts became fragmented, her memories slipping away. She saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision, heard whispers that weren't there, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the disease was alive, feeding on her fear and growing stronger with every passing moment. One night, as Emily was working in the lab, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She looked down and saw that one of the sores had burst, oozing black, viscous fluid. She screamed, but no sound came out. Her vision blurred, and she collapsed onto the floor, her body convulsing as the disease took its final hold. As she lay there, struggling to breathe, she saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, their faces twisted and inhuman. They surrounded her, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. They reached out to her, and in that moment she understood. They weren't coming for her. They were already inside her, the disease a manifestation of their presence. Emily's body went still as the figures closed in, and the last thing she saw was their malevolent smiles, knowing that they had won. The next morning, the hospital staff found her lifeless body in the lab, her face frozen in a grimace of terror. The disease that had plagued the hospital disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving no trace behind, except for the shadows that still lingered in the corners of the hospital, waiting for their next victim.